I was watching Sky News this morning and they threw to a little piece about the Cheddar Man. Now, the Cheddar Man is a male fossil and he has a skull, which is what all the fuss was about. And it was found in the Goffs Caves in Cheddar Gorge in Somerset in England. Now, he was dated to roughly about 9,100 BP. And now BP stands for before present. And the date that before present is determined is January 1, 1950, because that's when carbon dating became a reliable sort of a tool. So it doesn't mean we go back 2,000 years to the start of the calendar and then another 9,000 years. No, BP means before the 1st of January 1950. So it's about a 9,000-year-old and a little bit 9,100-year-old skeleton that they found. Now, they had done some testing on this originally in 1996. They extracted some DNA out of the molars and they extracted DNA out of another molar that was also found in the cave. Now, a little bit of contention about the results of that DNA test being found some haplogroup U5 within that, but people think there could have been a little bit of contamination. So the next one they did was 2018, which the tests have just come back. They drilled into part of the skull, they turned the skull to powder, and they did some testing from that. And they discovered that it was compatible with West European hunter-gatherers, and also determined that he had blue eyes, a dark complexion, and dark hair. The other interesting thing, before I move on, is that there were other bones and other skeletons within that cave which are 5,000 years older. Now, this is really important here. And this Cheddar Man's DNA does not link and has no match with those older skeletons. So this is very important. Keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to it. Okay, now he does match, maybe shares DNA. They're not descended from him, but he has the same DNA in him as about 10% of the European population. Now, which is rather interesting because before the more recent artificial migration and refugee status coming up into Europe, you probably could have said that maybe about 10% of Europe might have had dark skin. I'm going out on a limb here, of course, but that would be an explanation for something like that. Okay, so just before we move on to that, just so we know the history of the Cheddar Man here, it was claimed they threw to this woman called, I'm going to touch back on this Cheddar Man. They threw to this woman called Afua Hirsch, and I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, appeared to be standing in front of the museum, and I was expecting her to be telling me something that I hadn't known or could not know about the Cheddar Man or the findings or something like that. Now, she said a couple of things that really just fried my grits. One of them, she said, the white race does not exist. It's a social construct that began about 400 years ago. Then she waffled on something about white supremacists. And I was just like shaking my head like, this is supposed to be a story about the Cheddar Man, and you are waffling on about white supremacy out of the... Like, this isn't the time for some political platform to make some political statements about white people. I had no idea, and I thought, who the hell is this woman? Bit of a quick search, doesn't take long to find out that she is a journalist, of course, for Sky News, because she was the Sky News person they threw to, and a barrister as well. And she's half Ghanaian. But the other thing that was very interesting is that she made a fuss about Nelson's column, and she wanted it torn down and removed. Now, Nelson's column was erected in honour of Admiral Horatio Nelson, who defeated the French and Spanish fleets after being outnumbered in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. And of course he died as a result of that battle, and this column was put up in his honour, and she reckons it's some kind of form of white supremacy acknowledgement or something like it's just totally out there. Then of course I'm thinking maybe you're just making all these waves so that people can wonder who the hell is this person who's making all these waves. Oh, lo and behold, she's got a book to sell. So a bit of free publicity, you know, they say no such thing as bad publicity. Any publicity is good, and if you're selling a book, hey, the people who don't like you won't buy your book anyway, but the others who stand by you, they go, oh, look, she's got a book, I might buy it. Anyway, I don't know if that's why she did it or not. White race is a social construct and races do not exist. Okay, so social construct. And she also made a claim about there are more genetic differences between people of the same race than different races. And I just want to touch on that before I move on. So let's just take this, say there's 10 white people. So your claim is there's more genetic differences between those 10 white people than the one, say, Sudanese person from South Sudan. Okay, well, what about the 10 Sudanese people? Do they differ? Well, then you're telling me that the differences between those 10 Sudanese people is greater. I'm just picking Sudanese because they're nothing at all like white people from, say, Northern Europe or whatever. You're saying that there's more genetic differences between those 10 people than the white people. Well, how can two groups of 10 have more genetic differences with each other than the opposing groups of 10? That doesn't make sense, right? So, of course, there's no source to these claims, so I've got to just call BS on any type of thing like that says that sort of stuff. Unless it's elaborated on, unless there's a source quoted to verify the claim, it's kind of like BS. Now, I want to touch on the races don't exist. Okay, so here I'm going to refer to, we're getting into an argument of race realism at that point. So there are quite a few people that do think that races do not exist and that they are a social construct, and she appears to be one of them. She's not a biologist. In this case, I would refer to Jean-Francois Garapé. I hope that's how I'm pronouncing his name, or your name, JF, if you hear this video. JF talks about race realism, and I will put a link in this video below if you do want to hear the little, like 6-minute video where he talks about race realism. But I just want to talk, race realism is the statement that races exist in human populations, and human populations create subdivisions into groups that differ in very observable characteristics. And I'm going to touch on that in a second. Now, he also says the denial of the existence of races in humans is a denial of the complexity and diversity of the human genetics, physiology, and cognition, and it is this diversity which allowed us to conquer our planet and thrive on it. Now, about these observable characteristics, obviously, the three main large groups we have Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. They are the three main groups, and of course, whenever the police are trying to solve a crime, if they can't identify the body and they can't identify the which of those subdivisions, the main subdivisions a person is from, they test the hair, because the hair is different. Negroid, Caucasoid, and Mongoloid hair are all different from each other. So they can tell the general race of a person. They can't tell which country just based on that hair, but they know whether or not you're, for instance, a Caucasoid, Mongoloid, or Negroid. And of course, we've got the eyes, difference between a Caucasian eyes and Asian eyes. Obviously, there's a difference between a Caucasian nose and an African person's nose during to the nasal canal, based on needing to warm the air as determined by anthropologists. The air gets warmer into the longer nasal canal in the colder climate, and the warmer climate African doesn't need a long nasal passage to warm the air. Things like that. Now, of course, if you're walking down the street, you can see these people. You can look at someone and you know instantly that person's Asian, that person's of African descent, and so on. We know this. So obviously race is very observable, and it is not a social construct. If it was a social construct, how would I determine a person I've never seen before? If race was totally a social construct, how would I know walking down the street? Does my brain socially construct a filter and randomly put it over people, that my brain somehow knows that person's genetic origin, what country their ancestors come from, even though they're in my country? My country being the one that I live, not the one that I own, because I don't own a country. So, for instance, I'm in Australia. So if I'm walking down the street in Australia and I see a person, I can tell if they look like they're from India. I can tell if they look like they're from an Asian country. I can tell if they look like they're from an African country. This is very observable. They have facial features that are very recognizable. So yes, my brain doesn't instantly know that these people came from this foreign land and put some artificial filter over my eyes. So I go, oh, that must be an Asian. It's obviously not a social construct. There are very physical differences between the groups, the subdivisions of the people, and that's what we call a race. So it's not a social construct. Now, let's have a look at the qualifications of these people. Who are they? Well, JF is a PhD biologist. Fancy that. I think he might have a few things more to know about whether there are genetic differences between races and groups of people than a journalist who is a lawyer with no biology research under her belt. Just her feelings and what I assume is what could only be taken as anti-white speech, some of the things that she was saying. Now, in terms of the Cheddar Man being an ancestor of the white Europeans or the white English people. Now, as I said, remember, Cheddar Man's 9,100 years old. Now, here what we need to do is refer to the Arensberg culture. Who are the Arensberg culture? Well, the Arensberg culture came into Britain around 13,000 years ago. And they came into Britain when the Younger Dryas glaciation took place and basically created a land bridge between Britain and France. So they just walked across. Who are they? Well, the Arensberg culture are people from Scandinavia, North Germany and Poland. That's who the Arensberg culture are. Now the thing is, again, what I was saying, is it more likely that the white people in Britain came about as occasioned by a dark-skinned, dark-haired man 9,000 years ago? Or is it more likely that they are the descendants of the Arensberg culture from Scandinavia, North Germany and Poland? Now, the reason that the Cheddar Man would most likely be a visitor of some description is based due in part to the idea of the skin colour, that is, a dark-skinned person without artificial means, of course, living in these colder climates, would eventually over time suffer rickets from not having enough sun because this dark skin is keeping the sun off them. And they would develop rickets. Of course, you need sunlight to not develop rickets, and that's why the fair-skinned people have that edge. So in terms of whites being a social construct, clearly not the case. The Scythian people that came out of the Caucasus Mountains, they were described as having fair hair, fair eyes and ruddy skin. Ruddy skin is, of course, like a pale white skin, almost has a little tinge of red, which would be the blood vessels seen underneath because the skin is pale. These people came out of the Caucasus Mountains. They brought farming to Europe, great areas of Europe, and they brought mounted horseback warfare into Iran. And of course, today, you can find red-haired, and they had red hair as well, you can find red-haired people in Iran. You can find these light-skinned people in India. The Spanish talked about finding some of them in South America as well. So the idea that white is just something that started 400 years ago as some kind of social thought process, a social construct that's not real, is just asinine. It's just completely asinine. And the way that this reporter was carrying on, it was almost like she was trying to deny the ancestry of any white person that had British ancestry, a British white ancestry. She was trying to take their ancestry away from them. That's the feeling I had when I was listening to her waffle on and then going on about white supremacy and things like that. And yet it is far more likely that the Arensberg culture from, as I said, Scandinavia, Germany and Poland are the true ancestors of the white Britons. Of course, we do know that Britain was invaded. You know, the French came over and we already know about other Germanic tribes coming over, and we know about the Romans coming over. So there's going to be a little bit of that mixing going on. But and of course, all of that happened 4,000 years before Cheddar Man. So, you got bones in the cave, 5,000 years old, 5,000 years older than Cheddar Man, that do not match Cheddar Man's. Cheddar Man's DNA does not match 90% of Europe. So it's pretty clear that Cheddar Man is not the ancestor type person of Europe or the English people, because his DNA does not match 90% of them. So the claims that this lady was making, white culture, white people are a social construct and 400 years old, is absolutely asinine. If you want to know about race realism, I'll put the link in the description below. The video that I'm going to link to is one that was produced by Mouthy Buddha, just quoting some of the things that Jean-Francois had said. So I do recommend having a little bit of a look at that. And if you want to debate race realism, I suggest you get in touch with Jean-Francois, and I'll put links to his information below. You can click on that, and from that link that I put below, you can get to his YouTube. You can find his CV on his university page where he talks. You can read all of the papers that he has written, peer-reviewed and all that sort of thing about all of his studies. You can then make your own informed decision whether you need to believe a non-biologist journalist that white people is a culture that's only a social construct race that's only 400 years old, or history and biology from a biologist. I'll leave that up to you. You click the links below, but that's all I wanted to say. I was absolutely gobsmacked that this person seemed to be taking this news announcement as a platform to espouse anti-white things, making claims of white supremacy and things like that, and to try and deny the white heritage that white-skinned people in Britain have. Yet it can clearly be seen from anthropology and the likes that, if anything, the Cheddar Man's DNA matches the mixed DNA that was brought up and came into the area from Northern Africa and the Middle East back in that day, and that he probably crossed the land bridge somewhere around then. He could survive in the area, and he may have even been an offspring of a mixed race couple back in that day to account for the blue eyes, because the blue eyes originated from the Scythians coming down out of the Caucasus Mountains. Anyway, that's it for today's video. If you'd like to discuss anything in the comments, please leave a comment. Let me know. Have a go. Whatever. Keep it civil. I only like civil. If it results in name calling, the comment will be nuked. If it's just random accusations, the comment will be nuked. Let's just keep this discussion civil. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please share it with your friends and let me know what you thought. Cheers.